Hello everybody and welcome back to another video. I'm going to start this a bit differently. I'm actually going to give out a warning. Not for anything seriously bad, just something, I don't know, I'm going to give you an annoying warning, an anger warning, shall we say. This video is going to be infuriating for a number of reasons, so I encourage everyone right now to find your inner zen, go to your happy place, keep grounded, keep calm, because we're talking about starvation mode. Well, we are talking about why it isn't real, but we're talking about it nonetheless, and that is annoying. At this point, just the phrase starvation mode, it angers me, okay? It makes me angry because it's so dumb. Anyway, that is more than enough of an introduction. As a Hashimoto's patient and also a short person who has a very average height, person size, appetite, I got quite fat. A combination of fatigue, a very poor diet, and increased water retention led to my weight going up to around 200 pounds, which might not actually sound like a lot for a man of my age, but I'm only actually 5'3". Any fellow short kings say hello in the comments. Meaning my BMI skyrocketed all the way up to 35.4. So being grade 2 obese, especially with an autoimmune disease, is not fun. And you can call me fat phobic, but looking inflated, and I mean inflated, did a number on my self-esteem. Not to mention my genetic fat distribution, just the way I was shaped, ended up looking quite unnatural and disproportionate. And when I walked, I noticed when it got to its worst, I'd sort of waddle a bit, which is embarrassing to say, but I'm being honest here, that's what obesity is. At this point, I'd had more than enough and decided to do something about this to avoid further health complications and went to the Hashimoto subreddit to find some Hashimoto specific advice. While some of it was rational and helpful, a very large percentage of it was just pure bullshit, to put things quite simply. I'd mentioned that a 1000 calorie a day deficit is an option, but since Hashimoto's can have effects on metabolism, it may slow down. This is where the fat logic floodgates opened. Apparently a calorie deficit, 1, doesn't work under any circumstances, 2, is unscientific bigotry, and 3, that I needed to eat more than I already was because I was apparently in starvation mode. Reading these comments, I was a bit taken aback by the very poor comprehension of facts, but also not surprised. After all, Hashimoto's, as I've said here before, is a fat logic favourite, since a chronic overeater can always blame it for supposedly slowing down their metabolism so much that it starts pulling calories out of thin air. Or should I say, fat air. One annoying term that kept showing up was the eponymous villain of today's video, starvation mode. According to the geniuses over at the Hayes headquarters, which probably a big McDonald's or something, if you don't consume many calories, your body will store them all as excess fat and use none of them because apparently it panics and doesn't know when food is coming next. My grandmother, who in actuality was more like a mother to me, is one of those women who has been on every single fad diet going, and as an obese child, she kept telling me it was all because of starvation mode or genetics. Unfortunately, even in an information age that she wasn't lucky enough to grow up in, plenty of people who really ought to know better are still die-hard believers in the myth. The biggest testament to a fat activist's smug ignorance is the fact that if one was to look up the term starvation mode, the top results are all articles either disproving or very heavily doubting it. This myth actually originated in a 1944 study called the Minnesota Starvation Experiment, and fat activists today are still using it as misguided at best proof. Sam at Every Size did a fantastic video on the topic, and I've linked this below, and I would suggest checking out more of her work if you're into evidence-based debunkings of fat activists. Just aside as well, I'd like to thank her for some of the parts I used later in the video, some of the parts from the study she actually did point out in her video, and I'm just kind of covering this too for mine. But yeah, overall, Sam at Every Size, fantastic channel, got to be one of my favourite YouTube channels in general, definitely my favourite when it comes to debunking or reacting to fat activists, and is always of such a high quality, so well researched, so please go check her out. To summarise things, the experiment involved a group of men being put into starvation conditions for a prolonged period of time in order to study the psychological impact of famine, and also to find the most effective methods to treat famine survivors. A group of 36 healthy men were put through 4 different phases, starting with a 12-week baseline phase, then a 24-week semi-starvation phase, and finally 2 different refeeding phases. While all of this was happening, the men were also subjected to a lot of physical activity, walking 22 miles per week and performing daily activities and what they called busy work. The control phase may be overlooked in many discussions of this experiment, but it is crucial to today's video in quite a strange way. The men who were close to their ideal weight were allowed up to 3,200 calories per day to maintain their weight, and those who deviated from the ideal had their calories adjusted to bring them down to an ideal weight. This is important as none of the men were obese. Keep this in mind as it will come up later. And also the fact that caloric adjustment changed their weight and made it ideal already disproved a lot of the myths. The second phase was the semi-starvation phase, in which the allowed daily caloric intake was reduced to around 1,800 calories, and the physical exertion showed no sign of slowing down. The men were also restricted to a diet similar to that of Europeans during the final stages of World War II. The myth of starvation mode states that these men would have maintained or even gained weight due to their body holding on to everything it could access, but this is far from the truth. Each volunteer lost an average of 24% of their weight, and the pictures show them looking emaciated and bony. The weight that they lost as well was very, very close to the predicted 25% weight loss that was predicted based on their calories and activity level, again, supporting calories in, calories out, and sort of disproving starvation mode. They also demonstrated a range of physiological and psychological issues, including a slowed metabolism and increased rates of depression. Fat activists are probably getting some wires crossed at this point, since they believe that weight loss slowing the metabolism causes weight gain, and since none of them bothered to actually look at research, they've ignored some of the glaring issues in this logic. Obviously, the fact they lost so much weight in the first place disproves starvation mode, but there is more to it than that. Their weight loss did plateau over time as their caloric intake remained at a fixed number, and as their body weight decreased, they expended fewer calories per day. Therefore, the difference in calories in and calories out meant that less of their fat had to be metabolized to fill the gap. They additionally experienced a number of physiological changes associated with prolonged starvation, such as low libido, a lower body temperature, and a lower pulse rate, and they had very low BMIs. Ansel Keys, the lead researcher, wrote a book describing all of the results in the experiment titled The Biology of Human Starvation, in which he additionally wrote this. It is interesting that the obese man or woman can be placed on a diet as low as 600 or even 400 calories without the loss of body nitrogen or other ill effects, and without depression of the basal metabolic rate. In these respects, obese persons and persons of normal weight differ strikingly in their response to a low intake of calories. To phrase this differently, an obese person will not exhibit the metabolic changes or side effects that constitute so-called starvation mode. So with this in mind, we must really question what people believe it actually does. The fact that the men in the experiment, as well as people with restrictive eating disorders and famine survivors, lost weight proves that it does not cause weight gain, even when they suffer from the symptoms of prolonged starvation, such as metabolic changes. By this logic, why would an obese person gain weight if they do not experience either metabolic changes or the side effects of a low body weight? The side effects happen due to a much lower than optimal caloric intake, and when a person's pre-existing energy stores, fat, have been depleted, their body does have to conserve energy to avoid severe muscular and organ damage, but even this doesn't work forever. If you are still obese while supposedly starving for long enough to go into starvation mode, you still have energy stores, so will not experience the physiological side effects that the men in the study did. For example, a 456-pound man named Angus Barbieri fasted for 382 days, which is a Guinness World Record by the way, getting down to his goal weight of 180 pounds without experiencing symptoms associated with starvation or gaining any weight. He had access to all of the necessary vitamins, electrolytes, and hydration that he needed to avoid malnutrition, just no calories. I have additionally heard people claiming things such as that weight loss is only possible if one eats 6 or more times a day, since waiting between meals triggers starvation mode. This is also a myth, because if this were true, then intermittent fasting or one meal a day diets would never work. In order to avoid starvation mode, one would have to eat continuously throughout the day, grazing instead of eating proper meals. This misconception may actually explain why the fear of starvation mode can cause weight gain. If one eats many small snacks, then they may be massively underestimating how much they're actually consuming. The advertising industry has created misconceptions around nutrition, with one of them being that snacks barely count as real food since they're often small. Size doesn't always matter, as I have demonstrated by being a short king, as they are frequently highly palatable foods and very highly processed, making them easier to mindlessly overconsume. Grazing has also been correlated with insulin insensitivity, which can contribute to obesity in both adulthood and childhood. A lack of caloric awareness may be the main culprit behind most claims of starvation mode for a few reasons. First of all, most people likely cannot accurately define what starvation is and actually had to look this up. People may mistake hunger for starvation, not understanding that hunger is a normal biological feeling, whereas starvation is the most extreme form of malnutrition that most importantly causes illness or death. If one is not experiencing health problems or death as a result of not eating, they're not starving. As well as grazing allowing excess calories to slip in unnoticed, improperly counting or logging calories can be to blame. Eyeballing serving sizes without measuring or logging can massively sabotage weight loss by lessening the deficit. Some people will get frustrated when a diet doesn't work, cutting out certain bad foods or only eating specific food types in high amounts without counting the calories. Medical weight loss options can also be written off as useless if the individual doesn't comply with them. For example, there are many fat activists who say that weight loss surgery, semaglutide, and other medications such as orlistat don't work at all, even if they don't put in the effort. A lack of scientific knowledge can contribute to this, as the individual might not actually understand how the medical intervention works. My gran actually had issues with this too, and she took all this out for a while, but didn't actually change up her diet, and then spent ages wondering why it wasn't working. Even surgical options can be rendered useless if the patient doesn't comply with the diet and can stretch the stomach back out or burst staples, which we have seen time and time again on My 600 Pound Life. Semaglutide, as you may have seen in my other video, reduces hunger by regulating blood sugar, but if someone is an emotional eater or has a binge eating disorder, they can stifle the effects of the drug by eating over it. Somebody may additionally get frustrated with a dietary change or medical intervention and give up too quickly to see very much of an improvement. People might have too many cheat days, or skip on calorie logging, or forget to log drinks or small food since the calories seem negligible. What I couldn't help but notice is that the original starvation experiment showed more psychological effects than physical ones. The volunteers in the experiment not only suffered from depression and an ever growing obsession with food, but also with hysteria and hypochondria. When entering the first part of the rehabilitation phases, these psychological symptoms actually worsened in many of the men. At first, the men were split into 4 separate groups and received caloric increases of 200 to 800 extra calories per day, which led to the most psychological suffering. One man actually went as far as to amputate 3 of his own fingers with an axe, and he didn't know if it was intentional or not. He actually begged to stay in the experiment even when he was dismissed, and I believe he was eventually allowed to stay. I bring this up as I've seen fat activists saying that he did this during the starvation period as proof that dieting drives you crazy. I've also seen claims that the participants' bodies were so damaged by the experiment that they spent the rest of their lives in starvation mode and all became obese. But in reality, I have found absolutely zero evidence that they have become obese, even one of them. Even if they did, the evidence would indicate that it was the result of overeating. During the starvation phase, the men showed signs of food aggression that are often seen in starved animals. They were very, very defensive of their food and guarded it fiercely. They spend their lives avidly collecting recipe books even when the study was over. They grew very stressed over food waste. So, for example, in the canteen, if someone threw some food away, they would get really stressed out over that. They'd also chew gum until their jaws ached to the point where their gum had to be restricted to only 2 or 3 sticks a day, and used tobacco very heavily to mask the hunger. The worst difficulties came during the refeeding, in which the participants engaged in behaviours such as binge purge cycles, made meals last for hours, struggled to read their own hunger cues, developed body image problems, and became very socially withdrawn. They used excessive amounts of seasonings to add flavours to their food, and would even raid bins for food. All of this suggests that the most profound effects were all psychological, which supports the principle that obesity comes down to consumption rather than abnormal fat storage. Epigenetic studies have indicated that a supposedly thrifty gene essentially triggers starvation mode in famine survivors, but it is thought that these genetics are most likely the result of genetic drift rather than evolution or a selective adaptation. Starvation mode that may be used today doesn't mention physiological changes whatsoever, and instead focuses on psychological changes such as an increased desire for food. Your body is not starving, but psychologically you may feel almost as if you are. A smoker may have intense cravings even if they do not experience physical symptoms of nicotine withdrawal, and this applies here too. If you're used to overeating or a highly processed diet, your brain will have to adapt to a change. As smart as living organisms are, our brains work because of patterns and chemical signals rather than clear ideas or words, and this takes a long time to adapt. For example, the ritual of eating may actually be more addictive than the ritual itself, in the same way that some people who smoke cannot quit by vaping because the vape does not provide the same ritualistic thing in their mind, if this makes sense. If I haven't made it clear enough by now, calorie controlled diets only fail due to human error in the vast majority of cases. This is either due to improper calorie counting or failing to take metabolic adaptation into account over time. Starvation mode isn't making your body fat. If starvation mode is real, then it is making your mind fat instead, so to speak. Those who have become very obese cannot possibly understand how starvation actually feels, and in an era where every little sensation has to be pathologized and turned into an identity point, they simply cannot feel basic hunger without equating it to being actually starved. To finish up, there are just a couple more things I'd like to mention. First of all, fat activists act shocked that the men in the experiment didn't continually lose weight until they starved to death, even though the whole purpose of the experiment was to semi-starve and then safely refeed them. Second, the study that supposedly excuses and explains away their poor eating habits quite literally rules out any form of physiological starvation mode happening in obese people. And finally, as Sam pointed out in her video, it's very ironic that this study has been glorified fat activists when the lead researcher Ansel Keys has popularized and endorsed things that fat activists very, very firmly stand against, such as BMI, Mediterranean diets, anything along those lines. Cherry pickers will always cherry pick, I guess. Anyway, thank you for watching. I'd like to say again, thank you to Sam at Every Size for making this research a lot easier, and just her general videos. And as I've said, she's got to be one of the highest quality debunking or reaction channels out there. So if you like my videos, you will probably love hers. So go over to her channel, watch her videos, and also again, tell me what you thought about this one, any recommendations, what you'd like to see next. Thank you as always for watching, and goodbye.